Story 1. I worked late one night. I've been debating whether to post this, mostly because it sounds unreal when I try to explain it. But it did happen, and a few people at my job can confirm parts of it. I'm writing this now because I can't stop replaying it in my head. I work at a fairly normal office, accounting, project management, that kind of thing. The important part is that nobody works late. Ever. It's not one of those places with a grind culture or late nights. People leave at 5, sometimes earlier. If you're still in the building after 6, it's usually because you forgot something and had to run back in. A few years ago, there was a guy who worked there. I won't use his real name, but let's call him Mark. He wasn't close with anyone, but people knew him. Quiet, kept to himself. One day, he just stopped showing up. We later found out he'd been fired. No goodbye email, no farewell lunch. After that, nobody ever heard from him again. Over time, he just became one of those names that occasionally came up as a joke. Remember Mark? No, exactly. Last week, I stayed late for the first time since I started working there. There was a mistake in a report that needed fixing before the next morning, and I figured I'd stay an extra half hour and just get it over with. Everyone else left like usual, coats on, lights clicking off. By the time it was just me, the office felt different. Not scary, just hollow. The ventilation sounded louder. My footsteps echoed more than usual. I remember thinking how strange it was that I had never seen the office like this before. There were a few small things I noticed, but I didn't think much of them at the time. The light in the kitchenette was already on when I went to get water. Someone had left a mug in the sink. The microwave display was still warm, like it had been used recently. I assumed someone from another department had just left later than usual. I finished my work and decided to clean my mug before heading out. I went back to the kitchenette, turned on the tap, and looked up at the mirror mounted above the sink. That's when I saw him. For a moment, my brain didn't understand what I was seeing. In the mirror, behind me, was a man standing just inside the doorway of the kitchenette. He wasn't close. He wasn't moving toward me. He was just standing there, staring at me. I didn't recognize him. He looked thin, pale. His clothes were worn and slightly too big, like they didn't really belong to him. His expression mirrored mine, wide-eyed, frozen, like he was just as shocked to see me as I was to see him. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. I remember thinking very clearly, there is a man in my office, and I am completely alone with him. That's when the fear hit. I turned around. The doorway was empty. I didn't investigate. I didn't call out. I closed my laptop without saving, grabbed my bag, and left the office with the lights still on. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I told my manager everything. To his credit, he didn't laugh or brush it off. He went quiet for a moment, then asked me a few very specific questions. Where I'd been standing, what time it was, which lights were on. He called facilities and asked them to do a walkthrough of the floor later that day. At first, they didn't find anything. Most of the storage rooms and offices looked exactly the way they always did. Later that day, they found it. There's a small space behind one of the old storage rooms. It's not on any floor plan, just a narrow gap where some renovation work was never properly sealed off. Inside, they found a thin mattress, folded clothes, empty food containers, and a power strip running to an outlet someone had clearly modified. Someone had been living there. What made my stomach drop was the last thing they found. An old company badge, worn smooth around the edges. The photo was faded, but the name was still readable. It was Mark's. No one knows how long he'd been living there. Months, maybe years. He must have learned the schedule, known exactly when the building would be empty. The only reason anyone ever found the space is because I stayed late that one night. By the time they went back the next day, he was gone. I don't think he was trying to scare me. If anything, I think we were both just somewhere we weren't supposed to be. Story 2. I've been watching these security cameras for years. I've worked night security at the same place for a little over 4 years. It's an office complex, multiple connected buildings, long interior corridors, stairwells, storage areas, and a central atrium that echoes even when it's empty. Especially when it's empty. My shift starts at 10. By then, everyone's gone. No cleaning crew, no late meetings, no maintenance. Once the doors lock, the place belongs to the cameras and whoever's watching them. That's me. The control room is small. One desk, a wall of monitors, a chair that's just uncomfortable enough to keep you from falling asleep. I bring coffee, sometimes a book, but most nights I don't really do anything. I sit, I skim the screens, and I wait for the shift to end. People always assume you're staring intensely at every feed, like in the movies. You're not. You learn pretty quickly that if you actually tried to watch everything, you'd lose your mind. Instead, you develop a rhythm, a pattern. You glance, you cycle, you look for movement. If something doesn't move, your brain filters it out. That's important later. That night started like every other night. I logged in, checked the handover notes, and started cycling through the feeds automatically. Lobby, empty. West corridor, empty. Stairwell, empty. I didn't even slow down when I switched to the interior hallway camera on the 3rd floor. Not at first. I was halfway through switching to the next feed when I hesitated and flicked back. I couldn't have told you why. Nothing obvious was wrong with the image. The hallway lights were dimmed like always. The carpet pattern looked the same. No doors open. But something about it felt slightly misaligned. Like when you look at a familiar room and realize one piece of furniture has been moved just a few inches. I leaned forward in my chair. The image still looked empty. I stared at the far end of the hallway where the light didn't quite reach the corner. The shadows pooled there in a way that felt thicker than usual. Not darker, just more defined. I squinted. For a moment, I thought I could make out a vertical shape. Not sharp enough to be anything specific, just a suggestion of something breaking up the symmetry of the space. I blinked a few times and leaned back. Long shifts mess with your eyes. I've mistaken reflections for movement before. Dust on lenses, compression artifacts. All of it can play tricks on you. I switched to another camera. Different hallway, different floor. Same feeling. Again, nothing obvious. But after a few seconds, I felt that same hesitation, the same urge to look closer. Near one of the door frames, the shadow didn't sit quite right. It was too straight, too narrow. I leaned in again, closer to the screen this time. If I really focused, if I ignored everything else in the frame, I could almost convince myself I was looking at the outline of a person standing still. Almost. I laughed quietly to myself and shook my head. This was ridiculous. I hadn't slept well the night before. My brain was clearly filling in gaps that weren't there. I moved on. The next camera showed a stairwell, concrete steps, metal railing, no windows. Empty. Except, near the landing, the shadow cast by the railing looked heavier than it should have, like it was overlapping something. I felt a tightness in my chest that I didn't like. I cycled back to the first hallway. The shape was still there. It hadn't moved. It hadn't grown clearer. But now that I knew where to look, I couldn't stop seeing it. My brain kept trying to complete it. Head, shoulders, arms hanging loosely at the sides.
That's when I realized something that unsettled me more than the shape itself. I hadn't noticed anything like this before because I'd never had a reason to look this closely. The cameras hadn't changed. The lighting hadn't changed. Only my attention had. I stood up and walked a slow circle around the control room, trying to reset myself. I splashed some water on my face in the small sink and took a few deep breaths. When I sat back down, I avoided those cameras at first. I focused on exterior feeds, parking lots, loading docks, places where nothing ever happens. Eventually, curiosity won. I went back to the interior cameras, slower this time. The shapes were still there, not clearer, not moving, just consistent. That's when I decided to check the old footage. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. I just needed to know if this was new. I pulled up a random clip from earlier that night. The same hallway, the same corner, the same subtle disruption in the shadows. I scrubbed back a few hours. Still there. The previous night. Still there. I picked a random date from weeks ago. There it was again.
Once I knew where to look, I could see it in every clip I checked. Always far back in the frame. Always positioned in a way that made sense for the camera angle. Never centered, never obvious. It blended in perfectly. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the screens without really seeing them. I kept thinking that once you decide something is there, your brain will do the rest of the work for you. You start confirming your own suspicion. That's how people end up convinced they saw things they didn't. So I tried to do the opposite. I forced myself to stop looking for the shape. I went back to my routine. I cycled through the cameras at my normal pace. I looked for doors opening, lights turning on, anything that actually mattered. But every time I passed one of the interior feeds, my eyes went straight to the same places, and I didn't have to work as hard anymore. The shape was easier to see now, not by much, just enough that I didn't have to squint. The contrast between it and the background had sharpened slightly, like the camera had adjusted its exposure. On one hallway feed, I could tell which way it was facing, toward the camera. I felt a chill run through me, the kind that starts in your shoulders and slides down your spine. I checked the timestamp. Live. I switched to the next interior camera. There it was again, closer than before. It still wasn't doing anything dramatic. It wasn't moving fast. It wasn't reaching for the lens or waving or making any kind of gesture. It was just standing there, occupying space more confidently than it had earlier. I flipped through more feeds, faster now. Every interior camera had it somewhere in the frame, sometimes near a doorway, sometimes at the end of a corridor, sometimes half lit by an overhead fixture, always positioned naturally, like it knew exactly where to stand to be seen. I stopped on a camera that covered a long corridor leading toward the central atrium. The figure stood at the far end, clearer than I'd seen it yet. The outline was unmistakably human now. Head, shoulders, torso, arms hanging loosely at its sides. Still no facial features. The camera adjusted again, sharpening slightly as it would for any subject moving closer. The figure took a step forward. Not suddenly, not aggressively, just one slow, deliberate step. I felt my heart start to pound. I could hear it in my ears, louder than the hum of the monitors. I glanced at the other screens. On each one, the figure was closer than it had been moments ago. Not walking through hallways, not traveling between floors, just nearer to the cameras themselves. I switched to one of the feeds closest to my location. The figure filled more of the frame now. The camera struggled to focus, the image sharpening and softening as it tried to resolve details that didn't quite settle. The figure's head was tilted slightly upward. It was looking directly into the lens. I reached for the radio on my desk, then hesitated. What exactly was I going to say?
I think there's something on the cameras. Didn't feel like a sentence that would survive being spoken out loud. Before I could decide what to do, every screen went black at once. Not static, not interference, just clean, sudden darkness. The room felt impossibly quiet. For a moment, all I could hear was my own breathing. Then one feed came back online. It wasn't a hallway. It wasn't a stairwell. It was the control room. I was on the screen. Then there was a knock on the door.
Story 3. I worked night shift at a convenience store. I worked nights at a convenience store in my early 20s. Nothing dramatic ever really happened there, which is why this one night still sticks with me so clearly. Most night shifts were dead quiet. After midnight, you'd maybe get one customer an hour, if that. I usually worked with one other person, but we weren't always together. One of us would be up front, the other in the back stocking shelves, counting inventory, or working in the cooler. One night, around 2 a.m., a guy came in who immediately made my stomach tighten. There was nothing I could point to and say, that's the reason. He wasn't yelling, didn't say anything sexual or threatening. He just stood too close to the counter. He took a long time to move, asked questions that felt unnecessary. Slow night? You here all night? You get many people coming through this late? I answered politely but briefly. I remember watching his hands more than his face. He wandered around the store for a while, picked things up, put them back, never brought anything to the counter. Eventually he left without buying anything. As soon as the door closed behind him, the feeling passed. The store went quiet again, and I honestly forgot about him pretty quickly. Night shifts mess with your nerves, and I didn't want to read too much into a weird vibe. What I didn't think about at the time was that my co-worker hadn't been on the floor at all. He'd been in the back the entire time, working in the storage area. From that guy's perspective, I was completely alone in the store. When our shift ended, my co-worker asked if I could give him a ride home. His car was in the shop, and it was on my way. I said yes, without thinking twice. The parking lot was completely empty. It was one of those strip mall lots, big and open, but at that hour it was just darkness and my car under a single light, the only car there. We locked up together. He walked ahead of me to warm up the car and throw his bag into the back seat, while I stayed behind to finish pulling the security gate down. I had just turned the key when I heard him shout my name. Not yelling for help exactly, more like sharp and urgent. I ran toward the car, and my co-worker was standing at the open back door, frozen for half a second. Then he moved. The guy from the store was in the back seat. He was half lying across it, like he tried to stay hidden. When my co-worker opened the door, the guy startled and started scrambling, and that's when my co-worker grabbed him. There was no talking, no hesitation. My co-worker yanked him out of the car by his jacket and slammed him back against the side of it. The guy fought for a second, trying to pull away, and my co-worker shoved him hard enough that he stumbled and fell. My co-worker didn't chase him. He just stood between the guy and me, yelling at him to get the hell away. The guy got up and ran across the parking lot and disappeared into the dark. We called the cops. They showed up, took a report, looked around, but there wasn't much they could do. They never found him. It wasn't until later, when everything calmed down, that the details really sank in. He knew which car was mine because it was the only one there. He waited because he thought I was alone. And he was already in the back seat when we walked out. If my co-worker hadn't gone ahead to warm up the car, if I'd walked out first and gotten into the driver's seat. I quit night shifts not long after that.
I still get a bad feeling sometimes when I unlock my car in an empty parking lot.
Story 4. The room at the care home. I was 19 when this happened. It was my first real job, just a summer position, and I remember being mostly nervous about doing something wrong. I didn't want to mess anything up. I didn't want to be that summer worker people talked about later. I worked evenings and occasional nights at a care home. Not a hospital, not hospice, just a long-term care facility for elderly residents who needed help around the clock. The building itself was old but well kept. Long hallways, soft lighting. Everything smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. Most nights were quiet, predictable. You learned the routines quickly. Medication rounds, checks, documentation, and then hours of nothing but the hum of the building and the occasional call button. One of the first things they told me during my introduction was that the call buttons were connected per bed, not per room. Each bed had its own panel, its own signal. If a light went off, you knew exactly which resident it came from. They were very clear about one rule. If a call button goes off, you check. Every time. Even if you're sure it's nothing. There was one room everyone referred to without really thinking about it. It was a shared room with 2 bed spaces. One of the beds had been empty for a while. I never asked why. People come and go in places like that. Sometimes they move rooms. Sometimes they don't come back. The call button from that empty bed space would go off some nights. Not every night, not on a schedule, just often enough that people noticed. The first time it happened during one of my shifts, I asked the nurse I was working with what I was supposed to do. She barely looked up from her paperwork. "Just go check," she said. "It's probably a wiring issue. That bed's empty, but you still have to look." That became the standard explanation. A wiring issue. Old building, old system, nothing to worry about. And honestly, after a while, it really wasn't. You'd walk down the hallway, open the door, turn on the small nightlight, and see the same thing every time. One empty bed, neatly made. No one there. The other bed occupied by an elderly woman who had lived there for as long as anyone could remember. She was total assist, completely immobile. She couldn't get out of bed on her own, couldn't sit up without help. She also barely spoke. Sometimes she'd make small sounds, but actual words were rare. When the call button from the empty bed went off, she never reacted. She slept through it, or stared at the ceiling, or just lay there, breathing steadily. After a few weeks, the call button from that bed became part of the background. It would ring, someone would, and one of us would go clear it. Nothing ever changed. It was summer, and the nights were warm. The kind of nights where time stretches out and everything feels slightly unreal. I remember feeling strangely calm during those shifts, like the world outside had gone quiet and we were the only ones awake. That night started like all the others. I was doing my rounds, checking rooms, poking my head into doorways. Most residents were asleep. Some were awake but quiet. The hallway lights were dimmed, casting long shadows across the floor. As I passed the room with the empty bed, I noticed something that made me slow down. The call button hadn't gone off. I know that sounds small. It sounds stupid even. But I had worked enough shifts by then to notice patterns. That bed almost always rang at least once during the night, sometimes more. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe someone had finally fixed the wiring. Maybe tonight was just different. The door to the room was slightly open. It usually wasn't. We kept doors either fully open or fully closed. This one was just ajar, enough to see the soft glow of the nightlight inside. I stood there for a second, hand on the doorframe, listening. Nothing. No movement, no voices, just the quiet breathing of the building. I pushed the door open a little more and looked inside. The empty bed
was still empty. Sheets neatly tucked, pillow untouched. Then I looked at the other bed. The woman was sitting up. Not all the way upright, but enough that she was clearly on the edge of the bed, feet on the floor, hands resting loosely in her lap. Her head was tilted forward, chin almost touching her chest. I froze. I had never seen her sit up before, not once. It always took two people to reposition her, and even then, she barely moved on her own. For a moment, I wondered if I was remembering wrong. Maybe she could sit up sometimes. Maybe I just hadn't seen it before. I stepped into the room. "Hi," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice calm. "Are you all right?" She didn't respond. She stayed exactly like that, staring down at the floor. I took another step closer. My heart was starting to beat faster, but I kept telling myself there was a logical explanation. There always is. "Do you need anything?" I asked. Slowly, she lifted her head. Her neck twisted slightly as she did, like it took effort. She raised her face and looked straight at me. Her eyes were open wide, focused in a way I had never seen before. She held my gaze. And then she spoke. Her voice was hoarse, strained, like it hadn't been used in a long time. "She isn't here anymore." For a second, I didn't understand what she'd said. Then it hit me. The name she used belonged to the woman who had been in the empty bed. I don't remember deciding to run. I just remember suddenly being very aware of how fast my heart was beating and how wrong it felt to still be standing in that room. I took a step back, then another. I didn't say anything else to her. I didn't ask what she meant. I turned around and walked out of the room, then immediately broke into a run down the hallway. I went straight to the staff room. I must have looked bad, because one of the nurses asked me what was wrong before I even opened my mouth. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but it came out messy and rushed. I kept repeating that she was sitting up, that she talked, that she said a name. The nurse I was working with that night let out a short laugh, not in a mean way, more like a reflex. "That's not possible," she said. "She can't sit up on her own, and she doesn't talk like that." I told her I knew, that I'd never seen her do either of those things before. That was why I was freaking out. Another nurse stood up and grabbed her keys. "Let's just go check," she said. It hadn't even been 2 minutes. We walked back down the hallway together. The lights were still dimmed. Everything looked exactly the same as it always did. When we reached the room, the door was fully closed. The nurse opened it. The woman was lying in her bed, tucked in neatly, on her back, hands resting where they always did. Her breathing was slow and steady. She was snoring softly. The bed beside her was empty, exactly as it always was. The nurse checked her vitals. Normal. She adjusted the blanket, smoothed it down, and looked at me with a small, tired smile. "She's been asleep," she said. "Probably for a while." I didn't know what to say. I stood there, staring at the space where I had just seen her sitting. There were no signs of movement, no messed up sheets, no indication that anyone had been up at all. The nurse asked if I was okay. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. We went back to the staff room. They offered me water. Someone made a joke about how night shifts mess with your head, especially when you're new. I laughed weakly, even though I didn't feel like laughing at all. The rest of the shift passed without anything else happening. The call button from the empty bed didn't ring again at all after that.